The California sun beat down on the tarmac, a blinding white heat that made the air over the asphalt shimmer. It was a dry, punishing heat that baked the dirt and clung to the starched fabric of their uniforms. Before a rigid formation of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Unit, Colonel David Reaper Miller stood, a man carved from the same granite as the mountains surrounding Camp Pendleton. His voice, a low rumble honed by decades of command and the sandstorms of Fallujah, cut through the humid air without needing to shout. Every Marine stood a little straighter under his gaze. "From this moment, you are an extension of my will," he stated, his eyes, the color of chipped flint, sweeping across the ranks. "There is no room for error. There is no tolerance for weakness. You will be sharp. You will be lethal. You will be professionals." His words were not a request. They were a decree, etched into the very atmosphere. He knew every face in the primary rows, every call sign, every strength, and every hidden flaw. He was a commander who believed his first duty was to his men, and his second was to the ghosts of those he couldn't bring home. His scanning gaze halted, narrowing almost imperceptibly on a new face. She stood at the end of the second row, a captain whose file he had reviewed with a skeptical eye. Captain Eva Rostova. Her record was solid, even impressive on paper. Top of her class at Intel School, distinguished service in Afghanistan as a drone coordination officer. But something about her posture, a quiet, unshakable calm that bordered on aloofness, set his teeth on edge. It felt like a challenge he hadn't issued. In a unit of roaring lions, her silence was a discordant note. He broke from his planned speech, his boots crunching on the gravel as he took 3 deliberate steps toward her. The formation held its breath. "Captain!" he barked, the single word a verbal jab meant to test her fortitude. She didn't flinch. Her eyes, a cool, intelligent gray, met his without defiance but without submission either. "This is a hardened unit. We've been blooded. We've been tested. We don't carry dead weight." He let the implication hang in the dusty air. "What's your call sign?" A ripple of anticipation went through the Marines nearby. Call signs were earned, often in moments of chaos or comedy. They were a badge of identity, a piece of a Marine's soul. To ask for one so directly was an interrogation. The captain's lips parted, her voice clear and level, carrying a strange melodic resonance that seemed out of place on the grunting parade ground. "Phantom 7, sir." The name landed not like a word but like a physical blow. Colonel David Miller, the Reaper, a man who had stared down death in a dozen deserts, froze. The stern lines of his face slackened. The iron rod of his spine seemed to soften for a single terrifying second. His mind, a fortress of discipline and control, was violently wrenched back 3 decades. The heat of California vanished, replaced by the blistering, oil-tainted air of Iraq. The formation of Marines dissolved, replaced by the memory of swirling sand and the deafening roar of enemy tank fire. He was a young sergeant again, pressed into the dirt, praying for a miracle. And a miracle had come, on wings of thunder, with a voice on the radio that had become a permanent echo in his mind. "Phantom lead to Dusty Boys, inbound for gun run." "Stand by." The ghost that had saved them. The legend without a face. The present rushed back in a dizzying wave. The sun was too bright. The silence was deafening. Every Marine in the formation was staring at him, confused by his uncharacteristic stillness. He was looking at Captain Eva Rostova, but he was seeing a ghost. His mouth was dry. The 2 words, Phantom 7, hung between them, a question, an accusation, a key to a locked door in his past. He finally managed to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper that only the first few rows could hear. "Dismissed." He turned on his heel, his movements stiff, and walked away, leaving a stunned formation and a captain who held her ground. Her secret, now a ticking bomb between her and the most formidable man she had ever met. The silence in Colonel Miller's office was a stark contrast to the roar of memory still echoing in his skull. He stood with his back to the door, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his steel desk. The cool, air-conditioned air felt alien. He could still taste the dust. Not the fine California dust, but the grimy, petroleum-tinged grit of a place he had fought for 30 years to forget. Iraq, 1991, Operation Desert Storm. He wasn't Reaper then. He was Sergeant Miller, a scared kid leading a handful of other scared kids on a reconnaissance mission deep in enemy territory. Their call sign was Dusty Boys. It had felt ironic at the time. Now it felt like an epitaph. The intelligence had been wrong. They weren't facing a scattered infantry unit. They were staring down the barrels of a Republican Guard T-72 battalion. His mind replayed the scene in brutal, vivid snapshots. The concussive thump of a shell landing 50 meters to their left. The scream of shrapnel tearing through the air. The frantic, static-filled calls for air support that went unanswered. They were trapped in a shallow wadi, their position being systematically zeroed in. Death wasn't a possibility. It was an inevitability, creeping closer with each earth-shattering impact. He remembered the face of his radio man, Corporal Evans, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost serene. That was the moment. The moment they had all accepted it. Then a crackle. A new voice cutting through the chaos with an almost supernatural calm. It was a voice devoid of panic, crisp and clear as ice. "Phantom lead to Dusty Boys, I have you visual. I see your smoke. Stand by." Miller had looked up, squinting against the harsh sun. A lone A-10 Thunderbolt II, a plane the grunts called the Warthog, was descending through a web of anti-aircraft tracers. It was the most beautiful, terrifying thing he had ever seen. It flew with a grace that defied its ungainly appearance, a predator ignoring the gnats trying to bring it down. "Phantom 7 in for my gun run." The world dissolved into the iconic, earth-rending brrr-t of the plane's 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon. It wasn't just sound. It was the hammer of God, stitching a line of destruction between his Marines and the enemy armor. Dirt and metal fountained into the sky. The ground shook with a different, more righteous thunder. The Warthog made pass after pass long after its cover should have been forced to withdraw. The pilot's voice remained steady, a lifeline of pure competence in the maelstrom. "Phantom 7 switching to Mavericks. Keep your heads down, Dusty Boys." The precision was surgical. One by one, the enemy tanks were silenced. When the last threat was neutralized, the voice returned, slightly strained now. "Dusty Boys, this is Phantom 7. Sky is clear. You are free to move. Good luck." And just like that, the Warthog banked, climbing back into the sun and disappearing. It left behind a silence that was almost as deafening as the battle, a silence filled with the ringing in their ears and the overwhelming rush of survival. They never saw the pilot. No one ever officially debriefed them about the flight. The entire incident was a ghost story, a miracle they whispered about in hushed tones. Phantom 7 became a legend, a savior without a face, a name spoken with reverence. And now, 3 decades later, that name had been spoken by a woman young enough to be his daughter on a sun-baked tarmac in California. The ghost had returned, and it was wearing the face of Captain Ava Rostova. The silence in the room was no longer hostile, but thick with the weight of a shared, impossible history. Colonel Miller slowly straightened up, his eyes never leaving the faded patch on the desk. The ghost had a name, Alexei Rostov. The Phantom had been a man, a defector, a father. He looked at Eva, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see an imposter. He saw a legacy. The calm confidence he had mistaken for aloofness now made a terrible, perfect sense. It was the composure of someone who carried a secret history inside them. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over the plastic-covered patch. He didn't touch it. It felt too sacred. He never said a word. Miller finally said, his voice rough, stripped of its command authority and filled with something older, more raw. "After the engagement, he just left. We never got to thank him. We never even knew." The memory of that day, which had for 30 years been a story of a miraculous, anonymous savior, was now being rewritten in real time. The miracle had a face. The anonymity felt like a debt left unpaid. Ava watched the change in him, the rigid anger dissolving into a stunned, almost painful reverence. "He wouldn't have stayed for thanks, sir," she said softly. That wasn't the mission. His entire existence here was about staying in the shadows. Taking credit was a luxury he couldn't afford. The only thing that mattered was that you and your men made it out. She carefully returned the patch to the drawer, the gesture both protective and final. He carried a picture of your unit, clipped from a Stars and Stripes article about the battle. He never told me the story, not the whole of it, but he kept that picture. It was his reminder of why he did what he did. Miller felt a tightness in his chest. His younger self, frozen in a grainy newspaper photo, had been a keepsake for the man who gave him his future. The magnitude of the sacrifice of a life lived in silence for a country that could never openly claim him was staggering. He looked at the woman before him, the daughter raised on this diet of duty and silence. The call sign wasn't a boast. It was a vow, a promise to a dying man to carry the torch he could no longer hold. "Your file," Miller began, shaking his head in a mixture of awe and self-reproach. "Drone coordination. Tactical advisement. It's impressive, but it doesn't say anything about this." "It can't, sir," Eva replied, her tone pragmatic. "Officially, the Phantom Squadron never existed. My father's service records are a labyrinth of redactions and lies. I joined the Marines to serve, yes, but I also joined to finish his work, to protect the home he chose, on my terms." She met his gaze, and he saw the steel of her father's will reflected in her eyes. "The call sign is for me, a reminder of who I am and where I come from. I don't expect anyone else to understand it." Before Miller could form a response, a frantic knock shattered the moment. The door flew open to reveal his executive officer, Major Evans, his face etched with urgency. "Colonel, we have a flash traffic priority 1. A humanitarian aid worker, an American nurse, has been taken by militants just across the border in the Zabul province. They're on the move. Command is spinning up a rescue. We're the closest asset. The real world crashed back in, cold and demanding. All personal history, all ghosts, were instantly relegated to the past." Miller's posture snapped back to that of the Reaper, his mind already shifting to grids, logistics, and threat assessments. His eyes flicked from Evans to Eva. The test was no longer about the past. It was about the present. It was about right now. "Get the team to the TOC in 5, Miller barked, his voice once again the sound of command. "Captain Rostova, you're with me." It was not a request. It was an order, and it was an acknowledgement. The legend of Phantom 7 had just been assigned to his mission. The Ghost was going to war. The silence in the room was no longer hostile, but thick with the weight of a shared, impossible history. Colonel Miller slowly straightened up, his eyes never leaving the faded patch on the desk. The Ghost had a name, Alexei Rostov. The Phantom had been a man, a defector, a father. He looked at Eva, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see an imposter. He saw a legacy. The calm confidence he had mistaken for aloofness now made a terrible, perfect sense. It was the composure of someone who carried a secret history inside them. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over the plastic-covered patch. He didn't touch it. It felt too sacred. He never said a word. Miller finally said, his voice rough, stripped of its command authority and filled with something older, more raw. "After the engagement, he just left. We never got to thank him. We never even knew." The memory of that day, which had for 30 years been a story of a miraculous anonymous savior, was now being rewritten in real time. The miracle had a face. The anonymity felt like a debt left unpaid. Ava watched the change in him, the rigid anger dissolving into a stunned, almost painful reverence. "He wouldn't have stayed for thanks, sir," she said softly. That wasn't the mission. His entire existence here was about staying in the shadows. Taking credit was a luxury he couldn't afford. The only thing that mattered was that you and your men made it out. She carefully returned the patch to the drawer, the gesture both protective and final. "He carried a picture of your unit, clipped from a Stars and Stripes article about the battle. He never told me the story, not the whole of it, but he kept that picture. It was his reminder of why he did what he did." Miller felt a tightness in his chest. His younger self, frozen in a grainy newspaper photo, had been a keepsake for the man who gave him his future. The magnitude of the sacrifice of a life lived in silence for a country that could never openly claim him was staggering. He looked at the woman before him, the daughter raised on this diet of duty and silence. The call sign wasn't a boast. It was a vow, a promise to a dying man to carry the torch he could no longer hold. "Your file," Miller began, shaking his head in a mixture of awe and self-reproach. "Drone coordination. Tactical advisement. It's impressive, but it doesn't say anything about this." "It can't, sir," Eva replied, her tone pragmatic. "Officially, the Phantom Squadron never existed. My father's service records are a labyrinth of redactions and lies. I joined the Marines to serve, yes, but I also joined to finish his work, to protect the home he chose, on my terms." She met his gaze, and he saw the steel of her father's will reflected in her eyes. "The call sign is for me, a reminder of who I am and where I come from. I don't expect anyone else to understand it." Before Miller could form a response, a frantic knock shattered the moment. The door flew open to reveal his executive officer, Major Evans, his face etched with urgency. "Colonel, we have a flash traffic priority 1. A humanitarian aid worker, an American nurse, has been taken by militants just across the border in the Zabul province. They're on the move. Command is spinning up a rescue. We're the closest asset. The real world crashed back in, cold and demanding. All personal history, all ghosts, were instantly relegated to the past." Miller's posture snapped back to that of the Reaper, his mind already shifting to grids, logistics, and threat assessments. His eyes flicked from Evans to Eva. The test was no longer about the past. It was about the present. It was about right now. "Get the team to the TOC in 5, Miller barked, his voice once again the sound of command. "Captain Rostova, you're with me." It was not a request. It was an order, and it was an acknowledgement. The legend of Phantom 7 had just been assigned to his mission. The Ghost was going to war. The Tactical Operations Center hummed with a low, urgent energy. Large digital maps glowed on the walls, displaying the jagged, unforgiving terrain of the border region. The air was cool and smelled of stale coffee and electronics. Colonel Miller stood before his team, a mix of seasoned sergeants and focused junior officers. Captain Rostova stood slightly apart, her attention fixed on a bank of monitors feeding live drone footage of a dusty, winding mountain road. "Listen up," Miller's voice cut through the chatter. "An American life is on the clock. We have a narrow window. Satellite intel shows the convoy stopped here." He tapped a location on the map, a cluster of ancient-looking stone buildings nestled in a high valley. 2 buildings, a primary and a secondary. We go in fast, we go in hard. Alpha Team, you hit the primary. Bravo, you secure the perimeter and clear the secondary." He turned to Eva. "Captain Rostova, you are our eye in the sky. You have control of the Raven drone. I want constant surveillance. You see any movement, any sign of the hostage, any unexpected hostiles, you sing out. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Eva responded, her voice calm and focused. She slid into a chair before the controls, her hands moving with practiced ease over the console. The grainy bird's-eye view of the compound filled her primary screen. The rest of the team began their final checks, the metallic clatter of weapons being charged and gear being secured filling the room. But Ava's eyes were narrowed, her mind working differently. The official intelligence was clean, too clean. A straight road, an isolated compound. It felt like a picture someone wanted them to see. She zoomed the drone out, scanning the surrounding ridges. Her father's voice was a whisper in her memory, a lesson from 1,000 hours in the simulator. "The obvious target is a gift, Ava, and gifts from the enemy are always traps. Look for what they do not want you to see. Look for the silence." She saw it then. A slight discoloration on a ridge overlooking the approach to the valley. Not a structure, just a patch of earth that was too uniform. "Colonel," she said, her voice cutting through the operational noise, "I have a discrepancy." Miller walked over, his expression impatient. "What is it, Captain?" "We're on a tight schedule." "Sir, look at this ridge, grid 79er Charlie." She manipulated the controls, enhancing the image. "The terrain pattern is wrong. It's camouflage netting. I'm reading a faint heat signature. There's a heavy machine gun position there. Possibly a DHK?" She shifted the drone's camera. "And this wadi here, it's a perfect approach route, but it's also a perfect ambush site. They're not just hiding in the compound, sir. They're waiting for us. This is a flask-shaped ambush. They want to funnel us in and cut us off. A few of the senior NCOs glanced over, their expressions shifting from skepticism to interest. Sergeant Major Davis, a man with a face like worn leather, grunted. "She's not wrong, Colonel. That wadi is a death trap." Miller studied the screen, his jaw tight. His plan, a straightforward assault, now seemed recklessly naive. He had been so focused on the destination he had ignored the journey. He looked from the map to Eva's composed face. She wasn't just watching a screen. She was reading the battlefield, seeing the enemy's intent laid out in the dirt and rock. It was the same prescient understanding her father had displayed 30 years ago. "All right," Miller said, his decision made. "New plan. We don't take the bait. Captain Rostova, you have the lead. Talk to me." Eva didn't hesitate. "We send a small element, no more than a fire team, to probe the wadi. Make enough noise to sell it. The main force takes this route here." She pointed to a steeper, more difficult path on the opposite side of the valley. "It's harder going, but it puts us on the high ground above the compound. While their attention is on the bait in the wadi, we come down on them from their blind side. And that machine gun nest on the ridge becomes our first target for the Apache support." A new, more complex plan began to form on the digital map. The team leaned in, the energy in the room shifting from urgent preparation to focused execution. Colonel Miller gave the orders, but his eyes kept drifting back to the woman at the drone console. The ghost wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a tactical advantage, and it was sitting in his talk, quietly rewriting the rules of their rescue. The night was moonless, a blanket of black velvet pierced only by the green glow of night vision goggles. The main force, led by Colonel Miller himself, moved like shadows up the treacherous, rocky path Eva had identified. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scuff of boots on stone and the low, rhythmic sound of their breathing. Down below, the 4 Marines of the bait team began their deliberate noise-making, the distant, muffled clatter of gear sounding convincingly like a larger force. In the TOC, Eva's world was a symphony of silent data. The drone feed showed the compound quiet and dark. The thermal scan of the ridge confirmed it. 2 heat signatures, a heavy machine gun. Her focus was absolute, her mind a bridge between the 2 elements of the mission. "All elements, Phantom 7. Bait team is in position. Main force, you are clear to crest the ridge. Apache 1, you are weapons free on my mark for grid 79er Charlie. Stand by." Her voice was the calm, steady center of the storm about to break. It happened in a heartbeat, a flicker of movement on a secondary monitor, an infrared bloom from a location no one had anticipated. A third building, partially dug into the hillside behind the compound, its entrance perfectly camouflaged, suddenly disgorged a dozen hostile figures. They weren't waiting to be attacked. They were flanking the bait team, moving with a speed and discipline that spoke of professional training. The bait team was about to be overrun. "Contact! Contact!" A voice yelled over the comms from below, the sound of rifle fire suddenly crackling to life. "We have multiple hostiles. They're coming from the hill." "They're behind us!" Chaos erupted on the radio. The careful plan was unraveling in seconds. Colonel Miller's voice was sharp in her ear. "Phantom 7, what do you see?" "We're not in position." Eva's hands flew across the console, her mind racing faster than the computers. The Apaches were minutes out. The main force was still minutes from their assault position. The bait team had seconds. She saw the entire battlefield laid out in her mind like a 3D map. The enemy flanking maneuver, the trapped fire team, the main force's approach, and the machine gun nest that still dominated the valley. She made a decision. It was a gamble that defied standard procedure. "Apache 1, Phantom 7, change of target priority. Engage enemy infantry at grid 82 Delta. Danger close. I say again, danger close to our forces. Gun runs only. No missiles." She was asking them to make a strafing run directly next to their own men. "Phantom 7, Apache 1, confirm that order." "That is danger close. Confirmed, Apache 1, execute! Bait team, hit the deck, now!" Her voice held a new, sharp edge of command. She then switched channels, her voice calm and precise, a mirror of the voice from her father's stories. "Reaper, this is Phantom 7. Do not alter your approach. The back door is now open. The main enemy force is committed to the flank. You have a clear path to the secondary building. The hostage is there. I am painting it for you now. She sent a laser designation marker, a bright, invisible beacon only visible through their scopes, onto the roof of the smaller building. Down in the wadi, the world dissolved into hell for the bait team. Tracers ripped through the air above their heads as the A-10s thundered in, their cannons tearing the hillside apart, chewing through the advancing enemy fighters. The ground shook with the concussive force. On the ridge, Colonel Miller and his team saw the laser spot bloom on the target building like a gift from heaven. The enemy's attention was completely diverted. "You heard her." "Move, move, move!" Miller yelled, leading the charge down the slope. They breached the compound wall without a single shot fired at them. It was the most audacious, perfectly timed breach he had ever executed. Back in the talk, Eva monitored it all, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just divided the battlefield and commanded 2 separate engagements simultaneously. She had seen the trap within the trap and had turned the enemy's strength against them. The voice on the radio, the unerring instinct, the willingness to make the ruthless call, it was all there. For Colonel Miller, storming the building, it was like listening to a ghost, a phantom from his past, guiding him to victory once more. The compound was secure. The last scattered gunfire had echoed into an unnerving silence, replaced by the urgent calls of "all clear" and "medic." The hostage, a terrified but unhurt woman, was being wrapped in a thermal blanket and led to the extraction point. Colonel Miller stood amidst the dust and the smell of cordite, his adrenaline slowly receding. He keyed his mic, his voice rough. "Phantom 7, this is Reaper. Objective secure. Package is safe." The acknowledgement that came back was calm, professional. "Copy that, Reaper. Good work. RTB." But for Miller, the mission wasn't over. The real objective was back at base. The flight back was a quiet, reflective hum. The Marines were exhausted, the buzz of combat giving way to weary relief. Miller sat, alone with his thoughts, the image of Eva Rostova at her console seared into his mind. He hadn't just heard a competent officer on the radio. He had heard an echo. The same cadence, the same unshakable calm in the face of chaos, the same instinct to see the battlefield from above and within. The ghost hadn't just been honored. It had been resurrected. He found her not in the bustling talk, but in the small, quiet room where they kept the coffee hot around the clock. She was leaning against a counter, staring into a steaming mug, the fatigue finally showing in the slight slump of her shoulders. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. He didn't speak at first. He just poured himself a coffee, the simple act giving him a moment to find the right words. The institutional brew tasted like acid, but it was real. It was now. He stood beside her, both of them looking at the blank beige wall. "Your father," Miller began, his voice low and stripped of all its command authority. It was just a man speaking to another. "Alexei Rostov." He let the name hang in the air, giving it the weight it deserved. "He saved my life, and the lives of my men, over the Iraqi desert 30 years ago." He took a slow sip, the memory more vivid now than it had been in decades. "I never knew his name. I only knew his voice, and his call sign." He turned to look at her, and she met his gaze. He saw the ghost of the man in the shape of her eyes, in the quiet intensity of her presence. For 30 years, he was a phantom, a story we told, a miracle without a face. He shook his head, a gesture of profound, weary awe. Today you weren't just his daughter. You were his shadow. The way you commanded that air support, the way you saw the field, it was him. It was all him. Eva's composure softened. A deep, hidden tension seemed to leave her body. It was the look of someone who had carried a heavy burden alone, finally being offered help. "He told me there was one mission," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "A group of Marines, trapped in a wadi. He said it was the closest he ever came to not making it home. He said he used every trick he knew. He never forgot your faces. He kept that picture. It was his reminder. Miller felt a lump form in his throat. The keepsake. The silent vigil. The debt he had carried all these years had been a two-way street. The Savior had been haunted, too. He would be proud of you. Captain, Miller said, the words feeling utterly inadequate for the magnitude of the moment. Not for the tactics, not for the command, but for the courage, for carrying that legacy and making it your own. He wasn't looking at a junior officer anymore. He was looking at the living, breathing continuation of a story he thought had ended long ago. The Phantom had a family. The legacy had a future. And in the quiet hum of the coffee room, a 30-year-old circle was finally closed. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the parade ground, painting the assembled Marines in tones of gold and olive drab. The air was crisp and clean, scoured of the previous day's dust and fear. The unit stood at ease, but there was a different energy humming through the ranks. It was a feeling of solidity, of a bond tested and proven. Colonel David Miller stood, before them, not as the distant granite reaper, but as a commander who had fought alongside them. His eyes scanned the formation, and this time, when they landed on Captain Eva Rostova, there was no suspicion, no challenge. There was only a deep, earned respect. He did not call her forward. There would be no medal ceremony today, no public fanfare for a story that was, at its heart, still classified. The recognition he offered was far more meaningful. He addressed the entire unit, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. Yesterday, you operated as a single organism. You adapted, you overcame, and you brought an American home. That is what this unit is about. He paused, letting his words sink in. But victory on the battlefield doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of intelligence, because of foresight, and because of the calm voice on the radio that sees the trap before it springs. Every eye was on him. He looked directly at Eva. Captain Rostova, he said, his tone formal yet filled with a profound personal gravity. The success of this mission rests on your shoulders. Your analysis, your command under fire, and your unwavering nerve saved Marine lives. You have my gratitude, and you have the gratitude of this command. It was a public, unequivocal endorsement. It was him, the legendary Reaper, placing his seal of approval upon her, not just as an officer, but as the inheritor of a sacred trust. A ripple of quiet acknowledgement moved through the Marines. They had heard the calm voice on the comms. They had seen the plan change in an instant, saving their brothers in the Wadi. They knew. Eva stood rigid at attention, but a single tear escaped, tracing a clean path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a burden finally, officially, shared. The secret she had carried was now a part of the unit's DNA. After the formation was dismissed, the colonel approached her as the others drifted away. The formality fell, away, replaced by the quiet understanding that now existed between them. "It's over," he said softly. "The ghost can rest now." Eva looked out at the horizon towards the mountains that had hidden their battle just hours before. She thought of her father's photograph, tucked safely away. She thought of his stories, his sacrifices in the shadows. "No, sir," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "It's not over." She turned to face him, her gray eyes clear and resolute. "It's just beginning. The work continues." Colonel Miller nodded, a slow, understanding smile touching his lips for the first time. He saw it then with perfect clarity. Captain Eva Phantom 7 Rostova was not a relic of the past. She was not merely honoring a memory, she was the next chapter. The call sign was no longer a ghost story whispered by old men. It was a living, breathing promise carried into the future. The legacy of courage had not ended in a desert 30 years ago. It was standing right in front of him, wearing a Marine uniform, ready for the next mission. The Phantom was gone. A warrior had taken her place,